Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mind Blown Zone, episode 28. This is called Epidemics, What Caused Spanish Flu, Black Plague, and Polio. This sounds exciting. How are you, Brad?
I am never better as usual. How about yourself?
Well, never better. Why not, eh?
Hey, all right. You finally joined me in the never better zone.
Yeah. I mean, that's the place of just continuing upward bliss trajectory, right?
Right, man. Upward mobility. It's the place to be.
Okay.
No
So I
doubt.
understand you're going to share a bit of interesting info here. So I'm going to read the introductory script. It goes like this. Epidemics/pandemics have been the source of tremendous fear-mongering over the centuries, present-day times more than ever. It's hard to think of a greater fear-inducing threat outside of war, and yet not a shred of evidence exists to support the boogeyman virus theory amongst all of these. Is it possible that the infamous speech by FDR in 1944, "The only thing to fear is fear itself," could be the actual explanation for the death and devastation these epidemics wrought? Exciting stuff.
Darn
What do you
good
think, Brad?
question. It's a darn good question. I'm going to set out to prove exactly this in today's podcast. What do you think?
All right. I think it sounds
Possible?
great.
Awesome.
I think it's certainly possible. So we got some nice quote from our friend Prentice Mulford. I'm gonna read it just to set
Please
the
do.
tone. Put a fear on a city, town, or country of some deadly epidemic or some great calamity, and hundreds of the more sensitive who may have no fear of that epidemic or calamity are still affected by it disagreeably. That thought. One moment, please. I just gotta interpret this. That thought affects them. Oh yeah, 1800s, eh? That
Mm-hmm.
thought current affects them in their particular weak spot. A fanatic predicts some great catastrophe. The sensational newspapers take up the topic, ventilate it, affect to ridicule, but still write about it. This sets more minds to thinking and more people to talking. The more talk, the more of this injurious force is generated. As a result, thousands of people are affected by it unpleasantly, some in one way, some in another, because the whole force of that volume of fear is let loose upon them. Some are killed outright. Entirely unaware of the cause, they open their minds more and more to it, dwell on it in secret, put out no resisting thought until at last the spirit, unable longer to carry such a load, snaps the link which connects it with the body.
Pretty good job getting through that 1872 writing style.
I tell you, it's just not easy. Like when it just starts in a weird way, like that thought current affects them. I'm like,
Right.
wait, huh? That thought current affects them. Oh, that
Right.
one.
There should probably be a hyphen between thought and current, in all honesty. It would make it read a little
No,
bit
it's
better, I
yeah,
think.
exactly. Yeah. That thought current. Yeah.
There it
All
is.
right. Well, so
Well, there it
take
is.
us into it, Brad.
And that's from Your Forces and How to Use Them, by the way, the book he wrote, a 7-volume book, that title, that's volume 5, page 612, where he says that. I think he's right on the money. Many have echoed these ideas in more modern times. I don't think as clearly as Mulford did. I don't know how he figured it out, but I do believe he's quite right. And as we'll see as we go through these 3 big epidemics that people love to talk about when I present the idea that viruses don't exist, one of these 3 usually comes up. In fact, funny enough, I was walking over to Waikiki just the other day, and a rainbow was up, and I made a comment about the firmament, and this older gentleman started to ridicule me a little bit. And eventually, as we were walking, we got into this discussion about viruses. And I mentioned to him that they didn't exist, of course. And he said, "Oh, yeah, right. Nobody ever got polio." And we went down the path for a few, maybe 5 or 10 back and forth. And clearly he wasn't ready to entertain the possibility. But interesting that when people hear this idea that viruses don't exist, these are, other than COVID or maybe HIV, which we'll talk about in the next podcast, these are the 3 big ones that come up: Spanish flu, polio, and the Black Plague. So we're going to dive into those today, see what happens. Ready to roll?
I'm ready. Spanish flu. Let's hear it.
So as I mentioned in the virus podcast and probably a few other times, nobody could see anything called a virus during the time of the Spanish flu. It was something that was too small to be seen with the technology of the time. So it was theorized or speculated that there was something after they would filter out all the bacteria and all the smallest things they could filter, they would still be left with this fluid, or what they called a filtrate. And this, whatever was left over, right, in this fluid substance, they said had to be a virus in this stuff. Now, that they could never take that stuff and make somebody else sick, that didn't seem to bother them in terms of pushing their, narrative onto people. So just want to make that a reminder that it really wasn't until the mid to late 1930s and really into the 1940s before the electron microscope actually came into use, and then they could actually look at little dots and things that were in the actual filtrate fluid. They could see little thingamajiggers in there, right? So it's important to note that in all of these, they really couldn't see anything. So, the next point I wanted to make about the Spanish flu was that, kind of like with COVID, for those of you not aware, the death tolls have been wildly exaggerated. And even up to this modern day, right, there was incentive to declare a COVID death, right? There was actually a financial incentive from the government to the healthcare organization to have a COVID death. They got paid more money to handle a COVID death than any other death by a landslide. So you can imagine something similar happening back in the days of Spanish flu, right? Anybody who died of anything even remotely similar, other than a motorcycle accident or a skydiving accident, which I do believe those are two of the more ridiculous examples of, that are on the death certificates of people today, right? COVID has the death, even though they got hit by a bus or, skydiving accident. There was plenty of that going on back at the time. It's also important to note, of course, that the name Spanish and flu really are neither one of them really makes any sense at all. It has nothing to do with the Spanish. It's a long story for why that came up. The real hallmark of the Spanish flu really wasn't flu-like symptoms, even though anytime you get really sick, there's always flu-like symptoms, right? I mean, you feel low on energy, you got a fever, you don't have an appetite, et cetera, diarrhea, vomiting, right? All these things qualify as flu-like symptoms. So, but anyways, it's a pretty inaccurate name that they gave it. And what I really wanted to cover in this one is that there are the materialists, which are most everybody in the alternative health space, have come up with a couple different potential explanations for this. And one of the first things I wanted to point out was that, in a rare moment of honesty, Dr. Fauci actually admitted that they had done many autopsies of bodies performed on the cadavers during the Spanish flu, and it showed that their lungs were filled with bacterial pneumonia. So that's interesting in and of itself that he would actually say that, because it wasn't flu, of course. Influenza is a virus, it's not a bacterial agent. So interesting that he would actually tell people that. He did that in an interview many, many years ago. There's also, probably the most popular explanation for the Spanish flu, and it probably has something to do with what's gone on the past several years with the COVID jabs, is that people want to blame it on toxic vaccinations giving to military servicemen. But this was prior to going to war, of course. They would get the vaccinations here in America before they would get shipped over to Europe. So, and this, of course, would have been 1915, 16, 17. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense, as I'll get into a little bit later, that, there were some negative reactions. There were certainly some deaths that happened, but those would have happened pretty much in the immediate, right? Wouldn't you agree, Matt? It would have happened quickly.
Right. And what I'm noticing the pattern here is that the axiom here is that some external anti-life entity caused this. Like,
right.
Either it's the virus, but if you're like, wait, I don't believe what the media is saying, it's not the virus, well, it must be the toxic vaccination given by the people who are on the same team as the media, right? Well, it's right. Like they're in collusion with the media, and it's a really toxic thing. Like just with COVID, it's like, well, no, some people might say, no, it's not a virus, but they still insist, well, it's the the biolabs in Ukraine that Putin's taking care of, and it was the deep state manufacturing viruses there and putting it in the vaccine. Like, okay, right. But have you seen any? Has either team seen any of these things? Well, no, but the experts have.
Right. Right. Yeah. There's never, it's always a theory. There's never really any support for it, which we'll see as we go along here. If any of it, and what you just said goes to my next two examples, which are other people have posited that there was this, there's a book, I forget what it's called, the Electric Rainbow or something like that. I can't remember the guy's name, but he posits basically that as electricity was introduced to mankind, en masse, humanity wasn't ready for all these electrical signals in the air, and it took some time to adapt to when they put out the first electrical lines, when the cell phones but one of those ideas is that there was some new radar and electromagnetic military equipment that was introduced during World War I, right, which is 1914 to 1918. And it was this new radar equipment. They hadn't gotten it tuned properly yet, and so it damaged the bodies of the servicemen who were in the vicinity of it. And that's a fairly popular theory. Again, you'll hear in a minute how it doesn't really make any sense at all when you hear about how things went down. But that's a popular theory. And the last one, of course.
The awkward thing about that is, all these ones always have exceptions. Like, you could say back to it, well, why didn't Tesla die? Why didn't the guys who were, inventing AC and DC electricity die? Why didn't Marconi, who was inventing radio, why didn't he die? It's like, right. Oh, well, it doesn't affect everybody the same. It's causal, but not causal to everybody because genetically people are different. Oh, okay.
That's right. Yeah, there's always, and ironically, right, it's always the number that do die is much, much, much tinier than the number that don't. Right. So that's also a telltale sign when 10% of the people died of this deadly vaccination or the deadly electromagnetic equipment. Right, 10% or 5%. How'd the other 95 get away with it? But yeah, the last one that's a popular explanation, it's the least popular, but it's also out there, is that the German pharmaceutical manufacturer, Bayer, right, had come out with this new stuff called aspirin. And it was newly introduced just before World War I, and it started to get a lot more heavy use during World War I. Of course, aspirin being a painkiller, they were distributing it widely to all fronts in the war. And people have posited that the dose was massively too high, right? It was too strong in the beginning, and that this effectively was poisoning the servicemen. But as we'll see in a moment here, that explanation doesn't really add up at all either. Now, did some people take aspirin and get poisoned and die? I'm sure that happened, right? But it doesn't explain this huge death toll, and more importantly, after the war was over. Mm-hmm. And only Fauci really, maybe the only thing he's been, truthful about his entire career, claim really fits the evidence, and we'll see why that is in a second here. So, first of all, the majority of people who died of the Spanish flu were fighting age men who were overwhelmingly shipped to the battlefields. Right? It wasn't the fighting age men that were able to get out of the war or draft. It was basically the men who went into battle and then came home alive were the majority that died, which is interesting in and of itself, because normally when a deadly virus goes around, it affects the elderly and the young. That's the idea we've been told, right? These are the two groups that have the weakest immune systems. So that in and of itself is interesting, that really the strongest of the humanity were the ones who succumbed most to Spanish flu.
Right. Yeah, that debunks any sort of immune system or genetic claims for why certain people died, right?
Right. It was men 18 to 40. It was the big death group. So it's also important to point out that the Spanish flu happened after the war was over. So you would think with this aspirin on the battlefield and this electromagnetic equipment and these vaccinations they were being given, they would have been dying in droves during the war, right? Of these various different things, not just, actual physical injuries from mortars and bullets and so forth. But this wasn't happening, right? massive death. And it happened all over the world. It happened in all the countries that fought, more or less, right? All the countries that were highly engaged in the war. So that's, a good chunk of Western Europe and United States, of course. So
Right.
as far
And
as the
I actually
vaccines
think
go,
this
go ahead.
is, right, if I can interject, this is actually one of the most critical points that it happened after the war. And
Right.
I was going to ask you for some more specificity, but I just Googled it quickly. And it says a significant number of deaths were packed into 3 especially cruel months in the fall of 1918. Just in case people are wondering, when did this really go boom? 1918, fall.
Right. After armistice, after the ceasefire was declared.
Right.
4 or 5, I forget when it was, but it was spring basically, or winter, February, March, April, when the war ended. So yeah. So it took some, and keep in mind, back in those days, it took some time. You couldn't just hop on an American Airlines flight or Lufthansa and get back home the next day or whatever, right?
You're on a ship.
You had to ship back. So it took months for all these guys to get back. So, many, many months, especially in America, for everyone to get home. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier, if vaccines were the cause, then there should have been, even distribution of deaths all throughout the war, because these vaccinations were happening before the war or before the people shipped out. So, but I don't buy this. People get a vaccination and then they die of it, 1, 2, 3, 4 years after the fact. That doesn't wash. So a lot of people will disagree with me on that, especially in the era of COVID. But I continue to hold my ground on that. If a
And just to add to it, like, okay, they're getting vaccinations before the war, during the war, all different times, and yet apparently still the toxic vaccination kicks in exactly in 3 specific months.
Right.
Wow.
Right. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And, some countries didn't vaccinate like the United States did, and they had, very similar results, fighting age, men 18 to 40, post-war, in that, basically at the tail end of 2018. And so, then we've got, of course, I think it was 35 to 40% of the people who died were non-fighting aged men, women, seniors, who didn't have any military explanations at all or vaccinations at all, but they succumbed to the Spanish flu. So it plenty of the death toll is people who never got any of these vaccinations. So you have to, there's just 1,000 different ways to throw that one out. So, the next one is the electromagnetic one. And this one really is pretty easy to put aside, that people, if in fact they were exposed to these harmful electromagnetic waves, they should have been dying there and then in the place where they were, this military radar was set up and it was tuned too high or whatever, right? And it probably would have just been a few brief events where they turned it on, and that night, 50,000 soldiers died in their sleep or whatever, right? You would have had something like that, right? If that were the case, right? If this was, some kind of microwave that cooked them or something like that.
Well, I don't think that would really satisfy people who are claiming this. They would be claiming that it's a low level dose that's killing over time.
Right. But once again, they have no evidence of this. It's just a theory. Right. And the book's called The Invisible Rainbow, by the way. And now that I remember it, think of the guy's name here in a second. I mean, it's an interesting book, and he's got some interesting causation things going on there. I'm not, putting it down all together, but at the end of the day, I don't know that he in his book talked about this in particular, but that people have extrapolated it over to the Spanish flu as being a real possibility. Anyway, it doesn't add up that they would all die in the same basic window of time. You'll hear in a minute what the explanation I think is accurate. So the Bayer aspirin one, again, I think it's also a fallacy. I'm sure people were poisoned with it, took too many aspirin, overdosed, whatever. But again, it doesn't explain, there should have been an even distribution of deaths. They should have been dying, in combat, on the battlefield. How they would all suddenly die, months after the war was over and they weren't taking it anymore. It doesn't make any sense at all, nor does it explain, again, all the non-servicemen deaths. So it's really a long shot to try to explain this one was caused by overdosing on aspirin. So anyway, those are the leading explanations other than a virus that are out there. Matt, any questions or comments?
Well, they're all pretty lame.
They're all pretty. The virus, it really sounds much better than all of those, which is one of the reasons that the the terrain theorist group out there doesn't pull a lot of people in their direction, because these explanations simply don't add up. But now we come to GNM GHK, and I give full credit to Carolina Markelin on the Learning GNM website for explaining this, and it makes a whole lot of sense when we bring Dr. Hammer's theory into this. So effectively, right, when anybody would go into battle, right, you just imagine being shipped over to a foreign country and handed a gun and, all right, go out there and kill the guys on the other side. You're going to have what Dr. Hammer would, of course, call the death fright conflict. And you're going to have it regularly and consistently, as long as you're out there. Even if you're not in, harm's way, there's the potential for you to be in harm's way, right? You're an enlisted soldier. And who knows when you could be asked to, step out and, and have to fire and be fired at against the enemy. And this is the death fright conflict, as I explained in a previous podcast. The psyche responds in real time, immediately, when you're afraid you're going to die, and it actually creates excess lung alveoli tissue, because the quickest way to die is lack of oxygen. So this happens, and the whole time that you are afraid you're going to die, you don't have any physical problems. You're actually healthier, oddly enough. Your body is getting more oxygen while you're afraid you're going to die, believe it or not.
And is that so that you're just more energetic, your brain's working better, or is it that it's afraid that imminently some sort of near-death experience could happen, and the body will need to be working very well in that time, or is it like a combination of both?
I don't think either. I think all it hears is, I'm afraid I'm going to die, right? Remember, the psyche doesn't have any concept of time.
Or specifically, objectively, what's happening, right?
Of course, yeah. It's taking figurative thinking literally. So you may be afraid you're going to die tomorrow night when you get sent out to the battle front lines on this particular front, right? But you're thinking in this moment, here and now, I'm afraid I might die. And psyche is responding in that moment.
Well, given my latest thinking on oxygen, like oxygen just seems to be the number one helpful thing to a soul, to a being, right? So yeah, it doesn't need to be thinking, oh, I might have a near-death experience or something like that. Just like, seems like things are bad, more oxygen. Simple as that.
Well, yeah, it's when you think I'm going to die, right, this moment, right, the only real way you're going to die is if you're going to run out of oxygen, right? Assuming you're not hanging from a cliff by your fingertips or something, right? So that's its response. It thinks, oh, you're afraid you're going to die. And keep in mind, this also goes to the predator-prey. I don't know if I've explained this in a podcast or not before, but the predator-prey model, right? Where when the prey is being stalked by a predator, and it feels like it's going to get killed, it freezes, right? That's its biological response, is to freeze, so it can't be seen and movement. And of course, part of that freezing is the shallower breath, right? It's trying not to see the chest moving up and down. And that biological response also causes this proliferation, so that the little bit of oxygen that they are breathing in is always being captured by the lung alveoli. Make sense?
Right. Yeah. So it's increasing the efficiency of the oxygen that comes in.
A little bit that's coming in, right? So it's kind of a twofold answer there. So with that in mind, right, as long as you were, think about these, young men. I mean, didn't know what was going on. It's just, 100 years ago. I mean, it had to be pretty doggone frightening for a lot of these men. And, who knows who was going to get home and who wasn't. It was, it was a brutal war. And as long as they were out of their element, right, they were still, enlisted in some military outfit and in a foreign country, they were frightened. They consistently would have thoughts of, I could die. I could die tomorrow. I could die tonight. They could bomb us, whatever. So this whole time, we're calling them, in GNM terms, conflict active throughout the whole war. And, conflict activity in this situation doesn't mean that they have any disease. It's the opposite, right? They're actually operating a little bit better, as I mentioned. But the moment that they get sent, the war ends and they get sent home, right, is the reversal. They probably didn't feel particularly safe until they actually landed in America and got back to the, to their home that they came from. And that's when the fear of death finally went into cessation for them. That makes sense?
Yeah, but I think I should correct one thing, because you said, when they're conflict active, they don't have disease, implying that they don't have physical sickness symptoms, right?
Right.
But I think the appropriate definition for disease these days is dis-ease. Like, they are diseased, right? They're having fear of death. So I think in that time they are diseased.
That's right. Yeah, you're right.
I just wanted to chuck in that because I think it's appropriate to move forward with that way of talking from now on.
They had disease of their mind, right? The psychological disease, right? They were frightened.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. Good point. So they're carrying a scare fright conflict, death fright conflict with them the whole way. Additionally, so now we get back to these soldiers arriving home. So what happens when they get home is the reversal of the death fright conflict is tuberculosis. It's bloody sputum. Blood in the mucus. They're coughing up, and this bacteria have now arrived. These tubercular bacteria have now been initiated and enacted, and they get initiated with a fever, right? When the temperature of the body goes up, and they go to work to break down this excess lung tissue. That's their job. Mm-hmm. And so all these servicemen start getting sick and coughing up blood, and it's horrific. And it looks terrible, and it frightens everybody. Of course, the doctors aren't sure that, who knows what's going around. And of course, this pandemic rumor gets started, and here we go. We've got all the other people that weren't in the war scared that they might catch this deadly virus, and so they have scare fright conflicts, right, which are a little different than the death fright. The scare fright conflict goes really to the bronchial tubes, right? That's really what's happening there. And because it's the newer tissue layer, so it's not the brainstem tissue layer of the lungs, it's the newer ectodermal tissue layer. The way that particular tissue layer works, instead of proliferating cells like a cancer, it actually necrotizes tissue. And what it's doing is widening the tubes, the bronchial tubes, to allow more oxygen to flow in and out of the lungs. So that's what a scare fright conflict is. And this is obviously, this can go on for months and months and months. But the key here now is that these people who started to get this bronchitis and problems with their bronchial tubes, and of course their lungs and nasals, all connected, they started getting sent to sanatoriums and hospitals. And this is the classic. Now we've got the hospital conflict or the abandonment conflict kicking in here, right? Where they go to these, basically, they feel like they're going to these places to die. And that is the scare fright is the bronchial tubes. And then of course the abandonment conflict is the kidney collecting tubules syndrome, or the water retention, right? Where we go into, the body that tries to retain water. And when water retention is going on at the same time that the healing process of the scare fright is going on, it's called pneumonia. And that's very deadly. Basically you drown. And that explains how Fauci sees bacterial pneumonia in the lungs of a lot of these cadavers. And it's very well could also the people suffering tuberculosis also could have the abandonment conflict, because they're being sent to these. And basically, if you have any symptoms of this coughing, wheezing, bloody sputum, they're sending you off basically to these places to die. So that's the GNM explanation. And let me take it one step further before I ask for your opinion. The deaths are tuberculosis and pneumonia, effectively. But here's one of the key things is that even today, I'll talk about this a little bit later in this podcast, but a lot of times the medical community changes definitions of diseases to trick us into thinking it went away, or this such and such thing stopped it from happening. It was something mankind did to stop it from spreading. But what's important to note here is that tuberculosis still to this day is called the poor man's disease. And there's a reason for that the only places that people claim to get tuberculosis anymore, like third world countries that have, you know, problems acquiring food. Well, just as it turns out, you know, in that time period, you know, 1918, 1919, protein was pretty hard to get your hands on. And really it was only the, you know, the middle class and the upper class that had regular access to a healthy amount of protein. And this is what Dr. Hammer says was the real killer, this real Spanish flu, is that a lot of these soldiers that came back did not have enough protein. And the tuberculosis bacteria need tons of protein to do their work. And if they don't have it, then it can cause a pretty rapid death spiral. And in fact, Dr. Hammer said you should eat that protein before 3 p.m. So basically breakfast or lunch, you should be eating that protein so that these bacteria have enough access to it to perform the work that they're doing. So imagine having a death fright conflict for 2 years. I mean, it would build up a tremendous amount of excess lung tissue, and then have these bacteria go to work to try to remove it, and as fast as, you know, as quickly as possible, but they don't have the proper nutrients to do their job.
So you're suggesting that because they can't remove it all quickly, it's kind of like, well, so what? So how does that increase rate of death? Okay, the bacteria can't work as efficiently. What next?
It's a good question. I don't know that I have the exact correct answer for you there, but I know that the bacteria have a certain period of time that they can live.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they have basically they have a limited life cycle. And with the, you know, the body has decided we need 4 days or 3 weeks or whatever the time period is to clean up this mess. And when they don't have what they need, basically the fuel to do their jobs, then they're unable to perform the work. And I think what happens is that the body tries to then encapsulate. So the psyche goes to step 2, which is to try to encapsulate the excess tissue, and you know, basically turn it off, but not remove it. So it could be that it was just too much tissue to be encapsulated. Basically, what you would call a lung cyst today is what effectively what would be the end result of that. And it was just too much. There was just too much tissue to be encapsulated, and they just simply didn't have the strength to do it. They were just too weak. I mean, this is what kills a lot of cancer patients, right? Cachexia. They're just too weak.
And do you reckon, I mean, like, look, if there's not even enough, if we say that, okay, the bacteria need the protein to do the job, well, if there's not enough protein, maybe not even enough bacteria are being created. So you literally don't even have enough, like, full stop, you just don't have enough resources to create bacteria. They can't do their jobs, and just all this trash just sits around in your lungs.
Ironically, Dr. Hammer says that the bacteria are created right alongside the excess lung tissue.
Oh,
believe it or not.
Oh, simultaneous, like, so you're suggesting the body wouldn't create bacteria at a rate inappropriate to the excess lung tissue being.
That's right.
Being destroyed, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
As the lung tissue is being created, so are the bacteria. And I've talked about this before, that there's an old diagnosis that used to happen a lot back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. It was called latent tuberculosis, meaning that you would get some sort of a test, right, of your lungs, you know, bronchial lavage or something, you know, get the lung fluid out, and they would find it loaded with tubercular bacteria, but they weren't active. They weren't doing any work, which, you know, we of course call sickness or disease today. They were just sitting there. So this is precisely what Dr. Hammer suggested was happening. So I think they just basically the temperature of the sick person, you know, who's kind of going into the healing phase, goes up. The fluid levels go up, the water retention goes up, and these bacteria are released to do their work. And then the person that's suffering just simply is not consuming enough protein. And this it's like a death spiral. So that's the explanation. You know, it's worth noting that a lot of people say, well, why didn't the same thing happen after World War II? And there's 2 reasons. One, protein was more readily available to the soldiers after the war, and there was also antibiotics, which killed all these bacteria that were trying to do their work inside of there. So what ended up happening was a lot of World War II vets ended up with a lot of lung cysts. They would later, a lot of them got surgery on their lungs years and years after for benign cancers in their lungs, lung cysts, in other words. So that's what happened to them.
Well, hold on a second.
Yep.
So if you're saying in World War One, okay, bacteria didn't have enough protein, they couldn't do their jobs, therefore they couldn't remove the tissue. But then and therefore death. But then in World War II, you're saying, okay, they use antibiotics, kill the bacteria. Well, that seems to be the same thing as bacteria not having enough protein.
Yeah, it's a reasonable point you're making, and I don't have a good answer to that. But that is the suggestion that's being made, is that they killed them off. So in other words, the bacteria were draining. This is the explanation. Sorry, this is the correct. The bacteria were draining all the resources of the body to do their job. The body was giving up everything, as many processes as it could, for these bacteria to do their job. And whether that's whether they were breaking down muscle, taking energy away from other vital processes to give these bacteria the fuel that they needed, that they got wasted away. Their muscle, their whatever energy they had in their body was being used for these bacteria, and it simply overwhelmed the body. So that's what would have killed the World War I soldiers. Make sense?
I got another suggestion.
Yeah.
Like, probably as people went through the World War I experience, like either in the collective consciousness or just, in culture or something like that, people learned how to not die from this issue. Many behaviors probably changed. Like probably people were saying, oh yeah, eat more of this protein stuff. And they did that, or yeah, take more care of people in hospital, It's just better overall reaction to the experience, even though they were kind of unconscious of like the reasons why they were doing those things.
Yeah,
People
that's part of it.
Either energetically responded or behaviorally responded differently. And humanity had just literally evolved to be immune to it in a way.
Yeah. I think all those things are part of it, right? I think everything had that. There was better hospitals, there was better, standard care, there was more protein in the diet, and there was antibiotics. All of those things combined prevented a second Spanish flu. Pretty simply. But that's the pushback that people get. Is that why didn't, if it happened in World War I, why not World War II? And I think that's the right answer. But they're good questions. And of course, it's so much easier to just say, it was a virus. Right? It's just so much easier.
But it went away. It went away. People became immune to it.
So much easier to just say it's a virus. That's what people want. They want the easy, simple answer. But really, the easy, simple answer is fear. Fear is the killer here. And it's whether it's a death fright or a scare fright. This is the real. So your replacement for virus is fear. And of course, we hearken back to Prentice Mulford talking about this thought current of fear going through everybody.
And fear, the reason it seems so much like a virus is because fear is viral.
Yeah.
Like fear transfers in the exact same way that people think that this physical virus transfers.
That's exactly right. That's why they call it a mind virus.
Did you hear there was COVID? It's really scary. You could die. Like, really? Like, okay, now you have the disease about it.
Right. It is like a mind virus, first and foremost. That's right. So there's always a grain of truth in all these deceptions that we're being told. But yeah, absolutely. Good observation. Anyway, of course, there's no such thing as a Spanish flu virus. There's no such thing. No one has such a thing, in a test tube, and nobody's been able to take it and use it to, infect people or any of these things. Right? It's all absurd. There wasn't one, because that isn't what happened. So that's the Spanish flu. Any final comments or questions?
No. I think the Spanish flu one is kind of one of the easier ones to understand and feel confident in, because there was the whole war, and then boom, right after the war, that's when most of the deaths happened, like right in a concentrated period. So you can say, oh, the war ended. And then there was, like, it's so easy to just make that connection.
Right. Absolutely.
It
seems obvious. Why people want to stick to the vaccination or the electromagnetism or the aspirin one after they hear this one, I can't, fathom why they would. This makes way more sense. Way more sense. Theirs don't make any sense, frankly. Anyway, that's the Spanish flu. Let's keep her moving here. So now we're off to the black bubonic plague. And of course, for those people who have studied history a little bit, they'll know that there have been a number of different periods of time that this has been blamed for, massive deaths. It's not just one event. But the big event, of course, is known, throughout Europe. 1347 and 48 are the 2 years that it's supposedly kills off like 60% of the European population. And this is supposed to be caused by a bacteria. So I wanted this to be mainly about viruses, but this is, when it comes to epidemics, everybody brings up this. What about this? Most people don't realize it's a bacteria. And the cause of the death is that there's some mysterious reason. This is what they say happened. That there's some mysterious reason that this disease spread through the rat populations of cosmopolitan Europe.
Just all of a sudden, right?
Yeah, all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, and they don't have a good explanation. But all these rats allegedly died. Of course, there's no archaeological evidence of any massive rat die-off anywhere in Europe ever. Right? You're never going to find any such thing. But they claim now that the claim is that these bacteria that were on the rats needed a new host. So, of course, they jumped to the next best thing, which were
You got to be kidding me.
No, that's the
I've never even heard that before, but you should have seen the eye roll I gave. Like, oh, man. Oh, yeah, the bacteria. Like, oh, we need a new host. Like, absurd, right?
Right. Well, it was the fleas, right, on the rats that jumped, and then and then they carried the bacteria, and it's all
fleas. Okay, it's just so like it's just like the first thing's made up, the second thing's made up, the third thing's made up. It's just someone sitting there being like, I wonder if okay, stay with me here, right? Rats, yeah, lots of rats died, fleas, and then bacteria, humans. Fill in the blanks. Yeah, I reckon that's what it is. Let's say that.
Yeah,
it's absurd.
It is. As soon as you start to just critically think a little bit about some of these things, if you just stop accepting what you're told as truth, it's the ridiculousness of some of their explanations really starts to jump off the page, as you're wisely noticing right now. But that's the story. And if you go back and read some of these historic accounts, I mean, it sounds so insane and absurd, right? Like these stories of like bodies exploding and spraying blood and guts everywhere. And, even though when you look at the, a modern day symptom list, none of those things are part of it, right? Like every now and then they'll come out with this scare thing, like, oh, in Los Angeles, they were talking about the homeless population there, that the bubonic plague bacteria was circulating amongst the homeless in LA like 6, 7, 8 years ago. A few of these homeless people had gotten it, so they were, trying to fire up the scare engine on that. But if you look at the infection or the symptom list, and it looks like more or less like the flu. So what about all these exploding bodies and black blood and guts gushing out of? You know what I mean? It's like, wait a minute, it's as absurd as the rat flea bacteria thing. Anyway, this was claimed to be an infection of the lymphatic system, of course, which I don't know whether how many people even understood what that was back in 1348. Probably very few, if any.
I barely understand what it is now.
Right. But basically, the lymphatic system is basically like your disposal system, your garbage disposal, right? So,
yeah, I've heard that.
Taking all the cells that are breaking down in your body and waste and garbage that gets into your system, and it's just basically flushing it out. That's what the lymphatic system is all about.
And I understand that it doesn't have a pump.
Yeah, it doesn't seem
you
to
have
to
move
pump
around for it to for stuff in it to move.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why exercise is so important, right?
Mm-hmm.
Keep all that built up gunk that needs to be sent to the right place, which is obviously out of you. It's in your lymphatic system. But now Dr. Hammer says that the lymphatic system issues are all related to self-evaluation conflicts, which is interesting, right? Like mono and leukemia, things like this are what are common lymphatic system things, and of course both of these are related to self-evaluation or actually an existence conflict.
It seems to have the devaluation for this one seems to be, just from what I've read, seems to be like worthiness of living.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So what are the symptoms? Again, we have fever, vomiting, headaches, flu-like symptoms, swollen lymph nodes. I mean, how many illnesses, that follow those symptoms, like 1,000. So some of the unique things were this sometimes there was this dark discoloration of skin, and this is the reason this bubonic word came out was apparently sometimes the lymph nodes were said to break open, known as buboes. I don't know. I can't swear to the accuracy or inaccuracy of that, but that's one of the explanations why it's called bubonic today.
And I'd always heard bubonic, but you're saying bubonic, so
you're
you
probably
seem to be
right.
pretty certain about that. Oh, I really don't know.
I think you're right. I think you have the better explanation, the better pronunciation. Bubonic plague. I may just be poking a finger at it by calling it boob a little bit.
Yeah, I'm just doing a quick Google. I think it might be bubonic.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I agree with you. I think you got it right. Anyway, supposed to claim 30 to 50% of the European population was wiped out, which is like, 200 million people in the 14th century. And the mortality rate basically was half, 30 to 70%. That's basically 50, 55% of people. So think about that for a second. How many people must have been potentially dying? It was also, this is the same plague of Justinian that was in the 6th century that killed up to 50 million people. And it was also one in China in 1855. Anyway, so there were a couple different varieties of this. One was the bubonic plague, which were these dark black purple skin eruptions and from a GNM standpoint, these result from a feeling soiled, feeling defiled, feeling attacked conflict. That should be very easy to understand that people felt soiled, defiled, or attacked if there was this deadly, monstrous microbe floating around, killing everybody. So you can imagine the number of attack conflicts that were going on. That's what would cause the purple skin eruptions. There's also another thing called the septicemia. Did you have a question there?
Right, it just kind of makes sense. Like the symptoms, gross things on the skin, like aren't a direct, like they're like a secondary conflict. It's like, oh, people around me have this gross sickness.
Right.
It's disgusting. That's the whole feeling you get from the bubonic plague, right? Whenever you think about it, it's like, oh, isn't that thing that thing where it's really disgusting and it's gross, right?
Yeah,
So
you're afraid of it.
Secondary skin conflict.
That's right. It's the secondary. It's the corium layer of skin, the dermis, and it's what it's doing. It's building up your defenses of that layer of skin to protect you from this threat from the outside. It's just like the chicken pox and shingles that I explained in the previous. So that's the bubonic aspect of it. They also had this septicemic plague, and this septicemia is a real mystery. It's almost like a catch-all explanation for when you can't explain how the person died, you say septicemia. Which is a fancy way of saying blood poisoning. And it's the same idea, but that this type of thing would be kicked in from a brutal separation conflict, and you can imagine all the people being pulled out of homes and sent to infirmaries and away from the general population, with the slightest symptoms. So there was a lot of separation, what they call brutal separation conflicts going on. But people were said to lose toes because of the distress they were having. And this is how did Carolina say it? She said the ground one walks on is tarnished, right? You're afraid even in your own home that you're gonna catch this thing. So there's all kinds of rational, reasonable ways to explain this.
Right.
From attack and separation conflicts. But usually the septicemia kicks in when you're just really, really sick all around. You just got multiple diseases. You can't fight anymore. You're laid out. And then this septicemia thing. Like, no healthy person, walks into the doctor's office or the hospital the first day and, has septicemia. It's weeks and weeks and months of being laid out when this septicemia finally takes over and kills somebody. And then they had this pneumonic plague. Right, and this was the 100% death rate. Like if the disease progressed to this pneumonic plague, you've got the key there, pneumonia. Right, this is the scare fright conflict plus the syndrome. So this is the abandonment existence conflict with the scare fright, and this goes straight to what Spanish flu was all about as well. Right, so as soon as you were that scared you were going to die, and you felt abandoned, then you've got the double whammy, which is pneumonia, and that's very, very deadly, as Dr. Hammer discovered.
Okay.
once again, we've got what we have is this. We got to go all the way back to Mulford again here, and we just have a wave of fear flowing through the population. Right?
So
Everybody's
in Spanish flu, we have, the war. So what event do we have prior to this plague that we can say, that's why. That's why that was good.
I know you don't need an event. All you need is for everybody to be scared. That's the thought currents that matter. So if the town crier calls everybody to the middle of town this day and says there's a deadly invisible microbe floating around, this is actually another bacterial thing here, right? Then everybody's frightened to death. Then that's all you need. It's all it takes. And then everybody's scared. And once everybody, it's just like what happened with COVID. Everybody was scared. And that's the mind virus. Yes? No?
Kinda, you know. It wouldn't stop me from continuing to take a look at what happened of the events of the 1340s.
Well, good luck.
Prior to say maybe 1346. So it even said severe begins in Crimea, they said. So I would even be looking at events around there for the initial cause.
Yeah, here's what I read. There was some war going on. How many? There was probably 1,000 wars going on at that time. But this is what I read, that what people call the origin of it, and this is, take it or leave it. It's anybody's guess whether it's true or not. But that one of the there was this fortified city that had built up the walls, and the marauding forces couldn't break them down. And they ran out of cannonballs or boulders or whatever to fire into it to try to knock it over. Mm-hmm. So instead, what they did was they took the dead bodies of their men and they started flinging them over the castle walls into this, and into the moats and into their water supply, and flipped them out. And that was how the rumor got started, that these bodies were had this deadly toxic substance in them, and that was allegedly one of the stories.
Yeah, so, and I mean that, like, when I think if I think of like an image of the plague, it's like these kind of like in Monty Python, where the people are walking around with the cart going, "Bring out your dead,"
right?
It's like, or just dead, festering bodies on the streets, being wheeled throughout the streets, and it's this like proximity of yourself to just rotting dead people. Yeah. Right, so. It's as if like it's seen as that seems to be the dominant image that is associated with. It's possible that idea is what spread throughout humanity and just manifested. Like everyone's thinking about it, like, I heard that. Oh, it's disgusting, and then it just manifested, and this fear of rotting dead people around you just became a real thing around everybody.
Yeah, that possibility. I mean, sensationalized to the maximum, right? And obviously anybody that displayed any of these weird bumps or discolorations or anything, right, would just be pulled from society and thrown into this dungeon to rot away. I mean, just imagine it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just horrific to think about it, the fear that induced in everybody. But absolutely, that is the classic image of it. How much of what we're told versus what really happened is true is no one will ever be able to say, well, these are the real facts about what happened in 1347 in 30 different European countries, right? Like, how can you possibly attempt to pull all that together and make sense of it? I don't think you could. But ultimately, it's just an enormous wave of fear, and if you didn't have the wherewithal to resist it by not believing it, then you probably succumbed.
I think the key thing there is, like, if you say it's a wave of fear, the next question has to be fear of what? And I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert here. I've only thought about it for a little bit, but to me, it seems like this fear of the idea itself, of just rotting dead people all around you.
Yeah, and that within that rotting dead people were these deadly bugs that would float out of them, and you would breathe them up, or they would get into your food or your water or whatever, right? You touch them on the ground, and however the case may be, that was the agent of transfer, is this bug, bacteria in this case. And all you needed to do, if you came in the vicinity of it, you're a goner, basically. So basically, they were afraid of something. Yeah, it was something invisible. No one could see a bacteria in 1347.
Right.
So there you have it. once again, it's all the thing that's killing them is their fear. Pretty simple. Anyway, that's bubonic plague. Any other questions or comments on that one?
Nope. How about we do polio?
We got 2 for 2 on fear. So polio is the trickiest one to try to explain it. I'll try to do as best I can with it. There's 3 major epidemics reported in the United States: 1916, 1949, and then 1952. The unusual thing about polio, and this is where it gets interesting, is that it primarily affected only children under the age of 5. We've got something strange going on here. And of course, the symptom is paralysis, either the limbs or the lungs. You may have seen those pictures of those young children in their iron lungs back in like the 1950s. Pretty creepy to imagine. You know, there's basically this big giant thing wrapped around them that breathed for them. So the terrain theorists offer some interesting, and I'll say some compelling explanations. This one's, I'm not going to be able to come down to a final conclusion on who's right, who's wrong. My gut tells me there's a mix. Some are right, some things are a little bit right, some things are a little bit wrong. But anyway, they suggest that, and there's some interesting evidence to support this, that they started using, really heavily using a pesticide made out of lead arsenate. So that's the element lead and arsenic basically mixed together. So that kills anything, right? So they're spraying that on the crops. And that said to start getting heavy use in 1916, which is interesting. And one of the interesting things that they point out about that is that the scarring on the children's bottom of their spinal columns is different than what they would then come out with. They eventually get rid of lead arsenate and they start using DDT. Everyone's heard of that. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, etc. That's the replacement. And allegedly, I've seen pictures, whether or not they're true or not, there are different looking scars on the spinal column of these children that got polio in that period. So that's an interesting little side note there. Obviously, the terrain theorists are pointing to this as being the cause of polio, is basically pesticide food poisoning. Another interesting and compelling feature of their explanation is that most of the cases of polio every year came in the summertime, July, August, September, into October. And this mirrors, of course, harvest season, right? Or, I don't know, probably not true in Australia. Is that true in Australia? That wouldn't be true in Australia. It's true in America.
Okay.
That's when your crops are being picked and eaten, is in that period of time. So it's another interesting correlation. I can't discount it. Of course, the implication is that these children that were eating these freshly harvested fruits and vegetables were also eating these pesticides, and how this is what somehow or another this got into their system, got into their spinal column, and because they were growing, right? They were unlike adults, they were growing, and this caused some sort of glitch in their growth process, and this is what would then lead to the paralysis. So this is my question always with the terrain theorist is, why does eating a poison or something, why doesn't the body eliminate the poison? How does it make its way from your stomach, which is full of hydrochloric acid, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Why would your body take it and try to use it or move it somewhere else other than straight out the back door?
Never and really very specifically.
What's that?
Put it here. Like, we'll put it here to put a scar on the spine right here.
Yeah, right.
This is what we'll do with it.
Right. I mean, the proximity of the bottom of the stomach to the the lower spine, they're close. Are they going to make some osmosis argument that it goes through the walls of the stomach and over to the spine? I don't know. I don't know what the explanation is, but this is my problem with a lot of what the terrain theorists talk about, is that we eat these things and our body doesn't know what to do with them. So it stores them, stores aluminum in our fat cells. And that may be true. I don't know, but it still doesn't add up to me why this would happen. So yeah, how does this DDT and lead arsenate go from the gut into the nervous system? It's not clear. Why doesn't the body eliminate it? And can they prove this osmosis idea that just, it's in contact with the stomach wall and it seeps through and gets into the, nerves? I don't know. So those are the questions you have to fend off. What do you think?
Well, I was having a thought about terrain theorists just now, and it's like they're It's like you're a materialist, but your political adversaries also already took the best explanation.
Yeah,
So
right.
you're like, oh man, they got viruses.
Right.
Well, what do
Easy.
we got? I don't know, lead arsenate. Well, let's just go with that.
Right, right. Yeah, there's no question that the establishment's got the quick, fast, and easy explanation,
Yeah, like
especially for this one.
anti-establishment materialists. That's what terrain theorists are.
Right, there you go. So, but sticking with my theme, right? The fear of getting polio was massive in this era, right? And mothers and parents were just worried sick about their kids. They weren't allowed to go to the swimming holes or the swimming pools. This is when the whole, back in the day, and even my grandparents talked about this. Back in the day, everybody drank off the same glass. You'd go to like a watering hole or something, and there'd just be one cup, and you just fill it up, drink it, and give it to the next kid. And he would fill it up, drink it. No one thought anything else about it, right? And this is the propaganda that started with the Dix. This is when Dixie cups started to come out. Bernays worked on that campaign, right, to prevent the germs from spreading, and this was all brand new ideas in the 1940s and 50s. So there's a ton of fear
However,
going on.
I move again to request a original fear, like the idea, because the very first person who got polio couldn't have been afraid of getting polio, of getting these symptoms. So how did the very first people get those symptoms for it to become an idea?
All right, so we'll give you that answer. I'm going to hold you off for a second. It's a good question.
Okay.
But yeah, the fear of paralysis starts to go around. So that's the fear, if you might become paralyzed. So ironically, right, even to this day, we have similar numbers of children in particular that have what fall into the category of childhood paralysis diseases.
Okay.
So it isn't like, millions and millions of children were all getting the diseases in this one particular era, and then hardly any were getting it afterwards. What they do is that they just simply changed the name of or the description of the childhood paralysis. And here's a short list of really 7 different diseases that all fit the bill. We've all heard Guillain-Barré syndrome, especially with the COVID stuff. There's something called
how do you spell that? Let me look up a few of these. What's this first one you're saying?
It's called Guillain-Barré. A lot of people got it after the COVID jab. A lot of that going around.
Okay. It's pronounced spelled Guillain. Okay. So if I look at images.
Yeah, I'm not going to stick on this, but as you're going through here, another one is aseptic meningitis.
Sure.
Meningitis is something that's supposed to be bacteria in the brain and spinal column. Another one, they have a nice loose one called motor neuron disease, very, very generic. Another one is called transverse myelitis. There's another one called acute flaccid myelitis, like AFM. There's another one.
So these are just like nothing, right? Just abstractions that refer to specifically to nothing.
Well, it's children that have some sort of paralysis of their body, their limbs. I'm not even done yet. Alternating hemiplegia of childhood, AHC. And then finally, if that isn't enough, they have something, it's called a syndrome, not a disease, pediatric paralysis.
Oh.
So any one of these things could all look and present exactly like polio. And children get them every single year around the world. They just don't call it polio any longer. And I have on the list multiple sclerosis and ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease on here too. That's for the adults, because some adults did get polio back in the day, but it was mostly children. But here are a bunch of diseases that cause paralysis of children that happen to this very day. When you add all those up, you do come into this, tens of thousands per year, which is no different than these peak polio years. So that in and of itself is interesting, is it not?
Okay, so let me ask this question. So when I think of polio, I'm definitely no expert on polio. I barely know anything about polio. But when I
Okay.
think of polio, I imagine that thing with the foot. Like the foot's all messed up. The foot's like pointed down and like bent.
Yeah.
Right. So is that something that's specific to when they call it polio, or does that thing happen in all these other syndromes? Is this just my personal imagination of polio, or what's going on with this foot idea
I had two
in the collective
teachers
consciousness and that?
in middle school that had polio, actually, interestingly enough. It could affect any part of your limb, the foot, the knee, the hip, the arm, the shoulder, the hand, right? It wasn't just the foot, but yeah, that was certainly one of them was the foot.
And it seems like the
So
muscles just turned off. Just like it's not the foot pointed down. It's like it's just drooped down,
yeah, right. It was paralyzed, right? It was a paralysis.
paralyzed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, right. So Dr. Hammer, of course, suggests that there is this, all of these types of things have to do with some sort of movement idea, right? Can't move. I'm afraid to move. So the foot would be the foot, right? The feet are what move you. So
Sure.
you're afraid you don't want to move, or you can't move, or you feel stuck. All of these things are the ideas that land in the foot area. Just to answer your question directly.
Okay, sure.
Up into the arms and the hands, you get a little different story. We won't dive into all of those, but there's different, any paralysis of any limb, or any fingers or toes or feet or anything, all of these would be chalked up to polio, without a shred of evidence of a polio virus, by the way.
Oh, right. So in the media buzz time of whenever polio was, any paralysis, they'd be like polio.
Yep.
Okay.
It's not a lot different than, of course, today. If you look back at the 2020, 2021, 2022 flu cases, I don't know what it looks like in Australia in particular, but in America, they're basically gone. There were basically none.
Right. So was it like that before polio? People were getting paralyzed at the same rate, and then suddenly,
yes,
they just chunked it all into one thing?
Yes. But they started a giant wave of fear that parents passed to their children, and that exacerbated it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That exacerbated it. And don't forget our good friend Jonas Salk, what's the word for the eugenicist, who thought that wiping out people with low IQs was a good idea, was in charge of the polio vaccine, of course.
Okay.
A hero, according to the establishment, by the way.
So hold on. If you go back to, I think it was some sort of. Did Dr. Harmer tell me what else Dr. Harmer said was involved in the conflict that leads to paralysis?
Well, it's a self-devaluation ultimately.
Self-devaluation, right? So in the plague one was like, there's disgusting stuff out there.
That's an attack,
right?
Yeah.
So with the polio one, it's just okay. I suppose like the suggestion is that just children at a predictable rate all through history, just as children, get self-devaluation conflicts that lead to paralysis.
There you go. You just hit it. Nail on the head.
And at one point, they just chunked it all into one thing and said, there's polio virus, and caused a whole bunch of fear and made people go and inject absurdities into their body, right?
Right. That's right.
Make a bunch of money on that.
Polio is one of the really, how they proved polio, right? They took a, I forget what it was. They took, a dog or something and they injected some, they took a child that had paralysis and died, and they pulled the child's spinal column and brain, and they put it in a blender and mashed it all up, put it in a syringe, and and then shot like a cup of the fluid into a bunny rabbit's brain, and the bunny rabbit goes insane and dies. And that's how they proved the polio virus. Just for the record.
Yep, must have been a virus in there. There's no other explanation.
A cup of a dead child's ground up blended spinal column and brain shot into a bunny rabbit's brain. Yeah, that's not gonna cause any harm. Yeah, I mean, it's that ridiculous, Matt. I mean, if it wasn't that ridiculous, I wouldn't be where I am here today, understanding all this nonsense. It's that ridiculous. There's zero proof of a polio virus, or the the isolation of it and the infection of it, using it, on humans or animals. None of that doesn't exist. That's the best they got.
So it seems like they're potentially sitting around looking for symptoms and conditions that occur en masse and saying, we could probably make a specific thing out of that. Just turn that into a specific idea and call it polio and use the media to drum it up and make a whole catastrophe catalyst out of that. Yeah.
It's a question of, do they incite it, start it, and get it rolling, or do these things happen organically? Then they take advantage of them and magnify them, right? I don't know the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Effectively, it somehow or another, some fear gets flowing through the populace, and it grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. A lot of people, by the way, say that a lot of, researchers say that a lot of the causes of the paralysis during the polio epidemics was the vaccine itself. So it's another interesting idea. They were getting these poisons injected into them, and that caused some problems. Yeah.
Well, especially if you got the idea in you that if you're a materialist and you think, and you've got the vaccine, and then you think, wait, maybe the vaccine causes it. Okay. Then you're going to go deep into that, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's all kind of, at the end of the day, we have to come back to, you can bring something upon yourself by believing enough of this nonsense and generating the energy, frequency, the vibration of fear strongly enough, you can bring upon these kind of things on yourself. And ultimately, I think that's what's happening. Now, how does a 2-year-old child do this? I don't know. I think the mother has some, her fear has some, or the father or the guardian has some influence over the child, right? This resonance thing is the mother's scared to death of it. So that's a more complicated discussion. But they're definitely, and that's why I give some credence to this pesticide idea that these children were just somehow or another they got exposed to this pesticide, and I don't know, somehow or another did in fact get into their spinal column. Could be possible. I can't discount it.
It seems like you need two things. You need the idea itself, and then you need a reason to believe why it's going to happen to you.
Right. If there was no thought current going around, then there wouldn't be any problem.
Mm-hmm.
On the mass scale. It doesn't mean an individual can't decide, I'm afraid I'm going to become paralyzed because of reason XYZ. They can do it, but it isn't this thing like that. It's contagious and it's an epidemic, and it's coming to get you unless you lock yourself up in your home and avoid contact with all other humans, which seems to be, if you look at every one of these, COVID, Spanish flu, polio, and Black Plague, that was your way out of it, is to isolate yourself from the rest of humanity. Interesting, huh?
Yeah, go and live in a cottage and think up gravity.
Right? That's the theme with all these epidemics, is your fellow man is to be avoided.
Right. Yeah, and look at that in COVID. It's like they pushed it so far that people are like, you know what? I think we should all be 6 feet apart.
Right?
Let's not hug or shake hands. Let's bump knuckles.
We took it to the extreme here, despite all the evidence, every last shred of scientific evidence that showed that was absurd. We still did it anyway.
Yep.
Unbelievable.
Well, I didn't.
Yeah. A few of us did. We lucked out, or maybe we just decided to think about it a little bit. Anyway, that is epidemics. A lot of good questions and comments. This one, Matt, good job. So that's it. Anything else you want to top this one off with?
No, I think we're good.
Awesome. So I think as much as I don't like FDR and his administration being one of the worst presidential administrations of all time, sometimes I think of it as the worst. I think he was right when he said the only thing to fear is fear itself. I think he's right. I know he's right. You got to stay away from that fear. That's the final point I'd like to make. No fear, no worries. There you have it.
And I think Take Your Power Back is worth mentioning.
That's where I was laying up for you.
What,
That's right.
I mean, what is the purpose of it? On one side of the coin, it's to invite the positive spectrum of consciousness into your life, what you could call love or joy, and I don't know, oneness or something like that. And then on the flip side, it's to discard what's in the way with that, which is the fear and the judgment. So
that's right.
It's that simple. I mean, Take Your Power Back is just aimed at that, as solving that issue. When you've got too much negative fear and judgment in your life and pushing that away. Well, not pushing that away, but just dissolving it.
Yeah, even just looking at it, that alone is a huge step. Like, can you see it operating in your life? That's a nice place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And from there, you can make some decisions. What steps could I take to weasel my way out of this, work my way out of this? So easier said than done sometimes, but yeah, that's a part of it. The more empowered you feel, the less fear you feel. And that's a very simple equation, right?
Mm-hmm. It's available at themindblowenzone.com. And the video intro to that, the 30-minute video that we put together, is probably the most intriguing, mind-blowing video, in my opinion, in existence. Like, I know I wrote it, and that's a bit of a bold claim, but from my perspective, I think that's the top, mind-blowing video ever produced.
It's right up there. No doubt about it. Absolutely. Yeah. We encourage everyone to give it a listen. Think about it a little bit. Take some time, right? Mm-hmm. It's planting a seed for sure.
Yeah.
But something worth thinking about if you feel like you want to become empowered.
Okey-dokey.
Awesome.
Thanks everybody for watching. And thank you, Brad, for the wonderful information.
Yep. Well, I thank Dr. Hammer and Carolina Markelin over at Learning GNM for sharing a lot of that good detail, because I never would have came up with that on my own. But it all makes sense, and it needs to make sense for me. So there you have it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Matt. We'll see you on the next broadcast.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.